social, religious alienation of the leper to begin with. That's possible. There is a third explanation. What does the leper say to Jesus? Go back and look. What does the leper say?
You want.
You want to. So what if we imagine it this way? What if this is what's making Jesus angry? What if the leper comes to him and says, in effect, I don't want to put words in the mouth of the leper or to put words in the scripture, but this is essentially what the leper said. I know you can heal me. Right? Is that what he's saying? That sounds a lot like what the demons were saying back in Capernaum. I know who you are, the Holy One of God. See, I think there's some spiritual thing happening here. It's not black and white. It's not clear. There's some powerful emotional experience happening between Jesus and this leper. You could, if you wanted to. It's almost as if the leper is challenging Jesus. Almost as if he's saying, I bet you won't come this far. I bet you are just like all the other religious authorities. I bet you won't come where I am. Oh, you could, but I'll bet you won't. Now, why would that make Jesus angry? Well, here's the possibility. It would be the same as saying, the gospel you preach is good for lots of people, but it don't get this far. In fact, the God you represent has put a curse on my life. And that God could do something about it if that God wanted to. But you know what? I don't think that God really wants to. Now that I could understand Jesus being upset about. Because at that moment, it's not about Jesus anymore and the leper. It is about something much bigger. It is, who is God? So this is how I'm understanding it. I'm not saying this is the right way to understand it. You understand? I'm just saying this is how I'm understanding it. That the leper is saying, I'll bet you won't cross this line. Now, I don't know what the leper expected to have happen. But I am certain that what happened wasn't what he expected. Mark is so, I am so grateful to God for Mark's gospel, the way Mark doesn't explain anything. It just gives us a story and doesn't explain it at all. Forces us to wrestle with this. So grateful for that. And Mark is very laconic, but also very clear in what happens next. Jesus reaches out, and he uses the Greek phrases, stretches out. He's almost like, you know how they do in the movies, like they want to dramatize something, they'll make it in slow motion, right? That's almost what Mark does. He drags out this description. He says, and Jesus reached forth his hand and touched him. That, I'm certain, the leper didn't expect. Why? Because Jesus had just crossed an abyss of social, religious isolation. He had just crossed onto the side of the leper. Jesus heard the challenge and stepped into it. I do want to. Pretty amazing thing. Now, there's lots of scholarly conversation about the effect of this. Jesus, wanting the leper to be able to enter immediately back into his life, said, go to the priest.
Yeah.
Go to the priest, offer the sacrifice Moses commanded so that you can go home. Mark said, oy vey, that doesn't happen. Instead, the former leper goes home, apparently, and tells everybody. And you know what's interesting about the very phrases that Mark uses to describe the proclamation of the leper are the very same phrases that Luke will use to describe preaching the gospel in the book of Acts. And as a consequence, Mark says, Jesus can't go into the towns anymore. Now, why is that? Now, some scholars will say, well, that's because as soon as they found out, but remember, only God can raise the dead and heal the leper. As soon as a leper comes around and says, Jesus heals me, chaos breaks loose, and Jesus is no longer able to enter any towns because if he does, there'll be a riot, essentially. But there's another way to understand why Jesus couldn't enter. Because he had become impure. Because by touching the leper, according to the Levitical law, he himself became impure. He himself became an outcast. And he couldn't go into the towns anymore. That's one way of understanding this. Not the only way, but one way. It's the way that seems to make most sense to me today. So, do we feel like we can get closer to the anger of Jesus? Has this been helpful at all? Does it make more sense that possibly Jesus is not all sunshine and smiles all the time? Is it possible that following Jesus in our world puts us in situations where we are angry? Do you know it's possible to be filled with compassion and be angry at the same time? You know that experience, right? Where we see injustice and we have two responses. One is we want to help those who are treated unjustly, and secondly, we are angry, like Jesus. For me, that's helpful. For me, that's helpful. So I am grateful for the Gospel of Mark, for its ambiguity and the degree to which it forces me to try to get close to things that make me uncomfortable. And I'm grateful for a Jesus who can be angry at injustice, who can be angry at the distortion of God's goodness, and who will choose every single time to go there, to step across.